This is a big reason people avoid keto. They are so worried, not just people with type 2 diabetes, but everybody. They're so worried that, oh my gosh, that increase in the LDL-C must translate into I'm going to have a heart attack if it keeps going up and up and up. The funny thing is, we never have any data that shows high cholesterol leads to a heart attack. We have no data that shows high cholesterol actually causes heart disease in any way. We have lots of data that shows high inflammation levels do that. Lots of data that shows high insulin levels do that. So it's misguided, the mainstream medical when it comes to cardiovascular disease. While LDL-C is taken to reflect the role of LDL particles in the development of cardiovascular disease, it has been shown that measurement of LDL particles and ApoB, which is a measure of the number of atherogenic particles, can provide a superior assessment of your risk for cardiovascular disease, most notably when there is a discordance between the LDL-C and the LDL particle concentrations. And there can be, you guys. You could have an LDL-C come back at 250, but then your LDL particles, and especially the small dense LDL particles, would be completely within a healthy range. So what do you do when you have discordant numbers? You look at the one that's most accurate. Well, LDL particles are directly measured by that nuclear magnetic resonance test. That's the NMR. So I trust that one a whole lot more than I do LDL-C, which is only a calculated number. Don't forget that on your standard lipid panel, they directly measure HDL, they directly measure VLDL, they directly measure triglycerides, but they don't directly measure LDL. Why they don't, I have no idea. Other than a cost savings is the only thing I can think of. But they put all the numbers except for LDL through this equation called the Friedewald equation, and out pops this number for your LDL. And it's only estimated. And the problem is when you eat a ketogenic diet and you see your triglycerides go below 100 and you see your HDL go over 50, as predictably happens in just about everybody that does this and does this well, it's going to miscalculate that LDL-C. So that explains why when you run the particle size test, you may see a far different result than what you're seeing on a standard lipid panel. So I'm going to trust the particle size test over standard lipid panel in that case. This discrepancy is commonly due to increased levels of small dense LDL cholesterol depleted particles, which is the case of what happens for people with type 2 diabetes experiencing dyslipidemia. There is increasing evidence that levels of small dense LDL are predictive of cardiovascular disease incidence independent of the LDL. Did you hear that? We always talk about LDL being the bad cholesterol. And I suppose that's true, but you got to ask which one. Is it LDL-C or is it small LDL-C? And they're arguing in this paper, it's the small LDL-C that is truly the bad LDL cholesterol. Whereas in the general levels of large LDL show weak or absent association with this CVD risk. So if you have the large fluffy kind, which again is that pattern A, pattern awesome, remember that, pattern awesome, you're going to have those large fluffy kind. They're not going to harm you. Think about it. The bigger an object is, can it fit into a small hole? No. So think of what the large fluffy LDL are trying to do. They're trying to penetrate your arterial wall and cause problems. Well, it can't do that because they're so big. So the small dense, though, are smaller than the hole in your arterial wall, and that's how they get behind the arterial wall, start causing inflammation, and then that brings cholesterol to the scene of the fire where the inflammation is happening, and that's how you, quote, clog your arteries. This all make sense? The properties of small LDL that may underlie this risk include increased circulation time due to decreased receptor-mediated uptake, increased vascular wall binding, increased susceptibility to oxidation, and glycation. That's just a bunch of fancy schmancy words of damage is happening. And that is what LDL does. It goes in and it's basically the Tasmanian devil ripping a hole through every part of every artery, everything in your body, which is why you don't want to have high levels of small LDL. Assessment of other lipoprotein particle subclasses including those within the VLDL and HDL, have provided the ability to further assess this as well. We previously reported that 2 years of treatment with a continuous care intervention produced significant improvements in patients' weight, blood glucose, A1C, liver function, inflammatory markers, with no adverse effects on their kidneys. Participants in this continuous care intervention had a 0.9 mean absolute reduction in their A1C. So if they started at, say, 6.5 and they went down 0.9, on average went down on 0.9. So 6.5 went down 0.9, they're now 5.6. That's pretty good. Absolute reduction in A1C and a 10% average weight loss at 2 years. So if they started at 300 pounds, they're down 30 pounds. So this is a personalized carbohydrate restriction intervention. So they took each patient and customized the carbohydrate restriction that's right for them. And I love that they did that. So many of these studies, they just put them on some arbitrary, across the board, here's what everybody does, rather than trying to get to the heart of that person's individualized needs and customizing it to them. So I love that they did that in this study. They got guidance encouraging nutritional ketosis delivered and supported remotely through telemedicine, a one-on-one health coach, and a physician-led treatment. At the 1 year mark, the intervention resulted in substantial improvements in multiple cardiometabolic risk markers, things like triglycerides, HDL, ApoA1, ApoB, ApoA1 ratio, and blood pressure. However, there was an increase in the LDL-C, and that was maintained through 2 years of the study, despite seeing sustained improvement in the triglycerides and the HDL. To further characterize changes in LDL and other lipoproteins at 1 and 2 years, we utilize the technique of ion mobility, which directly measures concentrations of lipoprotein particle subclasses. So that's what they used. Instead of an NMR, they used this ion mobility. It does the same thing. You're looking for particle changes, particle size changes, particle number changes. And that's what they did. The primary aims were to investigate the effect of the intervention on lipoprotein subfractions, and they also did the CIMT. So again, the CIMT is pretty cool. It's just basically a little ultrasound that they run along your neck. So feel down below your jawline on both sides of your neck, and that's where the carotid artery is, and they do that intima thickness test using an ultrasound. So those were the primary aims of the study. The secondary aims included investigating the effect of this intervention on type 2 diabetes and its effect on dyslipidemia and atherogenesis, using both principal component analysis and assessment of LDL subclasses, which we talked about, the little particles. And then the second one, among the people in the keto group, compared the 2-year changes of lipoprotein subclasses and CIMT between individuals in the highest and lowest quartiles, looking at their LDL-C or their ApoB responses. Other aims included assessing potential relationships between adiposity, so that's stored body fat on the body, and beta-hydroxybutyrate levels, so that's their level of blood ketones, with their changes in lipids, lipoproteins, and LDL phenotype. So if you're just joining us, I am reading from a brand new study, just came out December of 2020, and it was published in the journal Cardiovascular Diabetology. The name of the study, you could definitely Google this if you want to go look it up. It is an open access. Anytime you see open access on a study, it means they put the whole study online for you to be able to afford to read. Most of them on PubMed and other places, they're behind a firewall. I usually have to ask a medical doctor friend of mine to print out some studies for me, and I will be doing that for you here at Keto for the Soul. But go check it out. Impact of a 2-year trial of nutritional ketosis on indices of cardiovascular disease risk in patients with type 2 diabetes. You are in the Keto for the Soul room. Click on the greenhouse at the top, subscribe, definitely click on my picture. You will see all my upcoming interviews, and whenever I address a study, I also put the schedule there in my bio. All right, let's get back to the study. Materials and methods is what's next. We're going to look at the study design and what the intervention is. The data analyzed for this study are measurements of cardiovascular risk markers obtained at baseline and after 1 and 2 years of follow-up. This is an open-label, non-randomized controlled trial of the effects of carbohydrate restriction, including nutritional ketosis, conducted in a cohort of patients with type 2 diabetes. In other words, that's the only kind of patient they wanted for this study. We want to look at what happens in people with type 2 diabetes. The study design, comprehensive details of the study intervention, and major exclusion criteria have been previously published in other studies. Briefly, the trial recruited participants had an established diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. They had a BMI of greater than 25, who self-selected to go into either the keto group or the control group, which is the usual care. All of the study participants were informed and consented to participate. The patients in the keto group received nutritional advice on carbohydrate restriction to achieve and sustain nutritional ketosis. I love when they don't just assume the patient knows how to do it. They gave them help, and they had a health coach that was right there for them, and they had telemedicine with various doctors that helped them along the way. They were initially advised to consume under 30 grams of total carbohydrates, approximately 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram reference body weight, and fat to satiety each day. Beta hydroxybutyrate, BHB, is the blood ketone marker that was used to see how well they were carbohydrate restricting, and they were looking for BHB to be above 0.5 millimole. So if you're trying to test blood ketones, the starting point for nutritional levels of, or therapeutic levels of nutritional ketosis is 0.5. Over time, BHB and dietary intake targets were modified according to the patient's health needs, goals, and values. The patients had access to a web interface software app that they used to communicate with their remote care team, and they got telemedicine-based treatment. The app was used to upload several biomarkers for monitoring adherence to nutritional ketosis and other health-related progress, things like body weight, blood glucose, and their blood ketone levels. The frequency of reporting glucose and BHB was adjusted to each person's preferences and current health needs. Participants with a confirmed history of having high blood pressure additionally received an automatic measurement to see how their blood pressure is doing. The reported blood glucose and blood pressure readings were evaluated routinely by a physician who then adjusted any kind of medications as needed. Via the app, participants had access to online resources and the opportunity to participate in a social support community. I love this study design, you guys, because again, so many of these studies, they just say, here's the intervention, now go have at it. And they don't really give them any help. Not only are they giving them a one-on-one health coach, not only are they giving them telemedicine help, they're also giving them a support community. So think of them all on some Facebook group, maybe even a group on Clubhouse. How cool is that to have like camaraderie amongst all these people? Patients who choose the control group comprised a reference group that was recruited from the same geographical and healthcare system. So the people in the control group who just wanted the regular care, they didn't want the keto intervention, they tried to find patients that matched the other patients that were in the keto group so they could make apples to apples comparison, or I guess for a keto analogy, bacon to bacon comparison between the two. All right. So what the control group did, by the way, is the nutritional and lifestyle advice recommended by the American Diabetes Association. This is the standard low-fat, high-grain, shoot insulin, All right, so let's get into some of what's called anthropometric measures. They were obtained for both groups at baseline 1 year and 2 years. Body weight and height were measured. They used a BMI to calculate what their body mass index is. Blood pressure. They did what's called a DEXA scan. If you've never had a DEXA scan, it's the coolest thing. You sit there real still and you basically have a fax machine go over the top of you at a super slow rate. And I'm 6'3", so it took a lot longer for Jimmy Moore than it would somebody like a 5'1" girl. But man, what it does is it tells you all of the lean mass on your body, which is your muscle. It shows body fat, how much percentage of that